of the birth movement in the United States. The concepts of marriage, reform, bodily autonomy, and self-ownership predated and evolved along women's demands for the vote beginning in the 1840s and 1850s and continued after the Civil War. This talk will expand our understanding of the suffrage movement by showing how women's birth control activism informed their suffrage work and vice versa.
Dr. Prescott is professor of history at Central Connecticut State University in New Britain. She specializes in the history of women in medicine and women's health issues with an emphasis on post-World War II era. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Prescott, and welcome to Serving Up History.
Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction. So this paper will explore the links between the suffrage history and the history of the birth control movement in the United States. These ties have received little attention from other scholars since the suffrage movement and the birth control movement are usually studied separately. While the term birth control was not coined until the early 20th century and popularized by Margaret Sanger, it is possible to find the roots of birth control ideology in the form of discussions of marriage reform, bodily autonomy, and self-ownership within suffrage discourse. These concepts predated and evolved alongside women's demands for the vote, beginning in the 1840s and 1850s, and continued after the Civil War. For some suffragists, most notably Elizabeth Cady Stanton, freeing women from marital slavery was the pivot around which other reforms would revolve. This paper will expand our understanding of the suffrage movement by showing how women's birth control activism informed their suffrage work and vice versa. The activist networks formed during the battle for the 19th Amendment would form the backbone of the birth control movement that continued post-suffrage. One can see glimmerings of birth control language as early as the late 18th century. During this period, some women adopted the language of liberty embedded in the American and French revolutions to make claims for their own equality, including the right to reproductive autonomy. In a 1780 broadside entitled The Sentiments of an American Woman, Esther de Burgh-Reed, founder of the Ladies Association of Philadelphia, observed that American women were, quote, born for liberty, disdaining to bear the irons of a tyrannic government, end quote. Reed believed that control over reproduction was essential to expanding women's roles in the new Republic of America. This link between women's rights and fertility control was made even more emphatically by the Scottish-born social reformer Frances Fanny Wright, who, along with utopian socialist Robert Dale Owen, edited the radical free thought newspaper Free Inquirer. This periodical promoted divorce reform, free secular education, labor rights, and other social causes. The newspaper also endorsed the British writer Richard Carlisle's Every Woman's Book, which criticized the sexual double standard and provided specific advice on how to prevent conception. In 1828, Wright began delivering a series of lectures on sexual freedom and women's rights in New York City, Philadelphia, and other cities. These lectures were published as a course of popular lectures in 1829. Religious leaders and political conservatives, of course, denounced Wright's views, calling her the red harlot of infidelity. Other women's rights proponents had to dodge charges of engaging in Fanny Wrightism, an epithet that associated any outspoken woman with sexual impropriety. Nevertheless, Fanny Wright's outspoken attitudes towards women's rights within the institution of marriage were repeated by other female reformers who emerged at the forefront of some of the most radical social movements of the day. Spiritualism, in particular, became a hotbed of reform thinking on marriage. Spiritualists had begun at advocating for marriage reform in the 1840s upon the basis of a doctrine they termed free love. The spiritual conception of free love did not mean sexual permissiveness, but rather emphasized voluntary motherhood, that is, women's right to reject husband's sexual advances in marriage and freely choose when and whether to have children. One of the best known advocates of this view of marital relations was Dr. Mary Gove Nichols, who staunchly maintained that women's equality hinged on their ability to control their bodies. Indeed, Nichols argued that women's suffrage for married women was meaningless without first reforming the institute of marriage. Nichols observed, quote, "As long as women promise to serve and obey their husbands, they can never be independent electors," end quote. Before women receive the vote, she argued, there must be a new code of marriage, new ideas of marital rights. In 1838, Nichols began giving health lectures to women audiences, including those at women's rights conventions, that formed the basis of her critique of the institution of marriage. In the published version of her talks, Lectures to Ladies on Anatomy and Physiology, published in 1842, Nichols asked if God intended that the marriage, quote, that the marriage relation, his own divine institution, should be the prelude to sufferings no pen can describe, end quote. Nichols was more explicit about the torments endured by married women in her fictionalized autobiography, Mary Linden, or Revelations of a Life, published in 1855, which aimed to do for women's rights what Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin had done for slavery. The book portrays in detail the sorrow she faced in a loveless, abusive marriage to a man who constantly demanded sex and could not support her financially. The book describes Mary's escape from this hellish relationship and unconventional remarriage that allows her to freely, she chooses, as well as determine when and whether to have sexual relations with her husband. Like Wright, Nichols' work was roundly condemned in the popular press. In his review for the New York Daily Times, editor Henry J. Raymond called Mary a child of hell and the slave of the coarsest lust. He asked, if a wife or husband may be abandoned at the convenience of either, why not a child or a parent or a friend? Why should any obligation continue binding after it becomes irksome? Such a degree of personal and sexual freedom, he argued, would create extreme social turmoil. This negative reaction to Nichols' writing, and it was pretty common, Nichols was on the radical side of things here. The negative reaction to Nichols' writings created a problem for women's rights activists. While some agreed with her ideas about marriage reform, they found her outspoken support of free love to be a liability. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, while agreeing with Nichols' claim that marital relations were the foundation of women's oppression, steered clear of her former friend. Lucy Stone, another suffragist, distanced herself from Nichols personally, but spoke out in favor of self-ownership, a position symbolized by Stone's decision to keep her maiden name after marriage. Other suffrage activists agreed with the concept of self-ownership. As Ernestine Rose argued in a speech at the National Women's Rights Convention in 1853, women's inability to be mistress to herself was the cornerstone out of which all other injustices emerged. Let us first attain ourselves, Rose declared. Give us ourselves, and all that belongs to us will follow. Thus, while Nichols' ideas about marriage were at the fringes of what was acceptable for the mainstream suffrage movement, Nichols did inspire other activists to keep alive the concept of self-ownership and discussion of women's rights. During the Civil War, most suffragists put their demands on hold, but free love discussions continued to circulate in the sex radical press and resurfaced in some suffrage writings after the war. Victoria Woodhull emerged as one of the most famous, or one should say infamous, of the postbellum activists devoted to women's suffrage, spiritualism, and free love. Woodhull, along with Susan B. Anthony, was one of the leaders of the New Departure strategy for achieving women's suffrage that emerged after the US Civil War. Defenders of this tactic, the New Departure, they call the New Departure, argued that because of the 14th Amendment, that had declared women were citizens by virtue of being born in the United States, women therefore were also entitled to vote like other citizens. On January 11th, 1871, Woodhull defended this argument at a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee, requesting that Congress enact such laws that would ensure that the voting rights of all citizens, regardless of sex. As we know, Congress refused to do so. As a devotee of spiritualism, Woodhull went further than most other suffragists in combining her demand for the vote with her support of free love. Like other free love advocates, Woodhull insisted on a single sexual standard for both men and women. In a famous lecture at New York City's Steinway Hall in November of 1871, Woodhull admitted, quote, "Yes, I am a free lover. I have an inalienable constitutional and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please, just as men did without legal or social sanction." She described the most damning misery that resulted from legalized prostitution, that was marriage, including thousands of poor, weak, unresisting wives and sickly, half-made-up children. Woodhull argued that the sexual relation must be rescued from this insidious form of slavery that compels women to give control of their maternal functions over to anybody. It should be theirs to determine when and under what circumstances the greatest of all constructive processes, the formation of an immortal soul, should be begun. So in other words, she's saying that women should have full control over their reproduction, even within the marriage. Free love, her position, of course, was considered outrageous by most. Here is a cartoon by the famous cartoonist Thomas Nast saying, "Get thee behind me, Mrs. Satan," which shows a wife carrying the heavy burden of children and a drunk husband admonishing Mrs. Satan, Victoria Woodhull, that "I'd rather travel the hardest path of matrimony than follow in your footsteps." Mrs. Satan's sign reads, "Be saved by free love." So the free love movement was at the radical fringe of political discourse at this time. And it was still beyond the pale for most mainstream suffragists. Susan B. Anthony went as far as to turn out the lights on Woodhull when she was on stage making a speech during a National Women's Suffrage Association suffrage convention. Isabella Beecher Hooker, one of the founders of the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, was one of the few suffragists who continued to support Woodhull in defiance of her family as well as the suffrage movement. Yet even Beecher did not condone Woodhull's radical views on free love. Still, some of Woodhull's more moderate suggestions about marriage reform were carried on in the work of Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was one of the three main leaders of the National Women's Suffrage Association, along with Stanton and Anthony, and served as both general secretary and president of the organization. Gage edited the official newspaper of the association, the National Citizen and Ballot Box from 1878 to 1881, and was co-author with Stanton and Anthony of the multi-volume History of Women's Suffrage. Gage's views on women's rights were shaped by the status of women in the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy, who lived near Gage's home in central New York State. In her monumental work, Woman, Church, and State, 1893, Gage described how the family relation among the Iroquois demonstrate women's superiority and power. Women had a key role in tribal government, and in the line of descent in these societies was determined through the maternal line. In the home, the wife's power over the family and her body was absolute. Gage observes, quote, "If for any cause the Iroquois husband and wife separated, the wife took all of her property she had brought with her into the wigwam. The children also accompanied the mother, whose right to them was recognized as supreme." Gage noted that eminent historian George Bancroft argued that the form of government of the United States was borrowed from that of the Six Nations. Thus, to the matriarch or mother rule is the modern word indebted for its first conception of inherent rights, natural equality of condition, and the establishment of a civilized government upon this basis. Unfortunately, said Gage, the laws of the United States neglected to include women in this vision of equality. In an article for the ballot box entitled On the Right of Habeas Corpus, Gage commented on how marriage laws stripped women of this most fundamental constitutional right. Value and right of personal freedom were recognized when our government was framed, Gage observed, but the laws of every state in the Union, in defiance of the writ of habeas corpus, that constitutional guarantee of personal freedom, placed the personal liberty of the wife entirely in the control and power of her husband, who can imprison her, and this without requiring any legal process whatsoever. The result, Gage said, was that the uncontrolled will of the husband is permitted to overpower the wife's constitutional right to freedom and the protection of the law. Gage addressed the issue of bodily autonomy directly in an article for the suffrage publication, The Revolution, entitled, Is Woman Her Own? This article was in response to an earlier article entitled Child Murder that condemned the twin evils of abortion and infanticide. Gage said the earlier article, quote, touched a subject which lies deeper down into women's wrongs than any other. This is the denial of the right to herself. Gage condemned abortion, but said that enforced motherhood was just as bad, calling an unwanted pregnancy as both a crime against nature, as both a crime against the body of the mother and the soul of the child. So she's not condoning abortion or infanticide, but she does say that unwanted pregnancy is, or enforced motherhood, as she called it, was a crime against the body of the mother and the soul of the child. Despite her instrumental role in the post-war suffrage movement, Gage was sidelined in the suffrage history because of her critique of the church. The merger of the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1890 led to increasing conservatism within the suffrage movement and a narrow emphasis on winning the vote. And so other issues were dropped. Gage opposed the merger of the two organizations because they refused to defend the separation of church and state. Gage also became concerned about the growing influence of social conservatives, especially Women's Christian Temperance Union leader Frances Willard, within the newly formed National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA as it's called for short. Gage called Willard the most dangerous person upon the continent today, and the temperance movement a serious threat to personal liberty. Gage soon left the mainstream suffrage movement and founded the Women's National Liberal Union, composed of those who, like Gage, believed that NASA was not addressing the full range of women's rights. Yet Gage's ideas about marriage continue to circulate among some suffragists. Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, made these ideas concrete in her 1891 lecture on voluntary motherhood. Motherhood is sacred, Blatch declared, that is, voluntary motherhood. Even the most conservative members of the suffrage movement expressed notions of bodily autonomy and voluntary motherhood. In her article for the Woman's Journal, Frances Willard explained that while marriage remained the greatest triumph of Christianity, the most important reform of all was the right of women to have undivided custody of herself. So even Frances Willard was saying that women had a right to bodily autonomy. Arguments about self-ownership and the right of sexual refusal and voluntary motherhood eventually transformed into specific arguments in favor of legal birth control. So we see a trajectory from this notion of voluntary motherhood to birth control. The term birth control gets coined in the 19-teens and popularized by Margaret Sanger. In 1918, Crystal Eastman, co-founder of the National Woman's Party, authored a short piece for Margaret Sanger's Birth Control Review that plainly stated that birth control was a fundamental tenet to the feminist program. She urged other suffragists, we must all be followers of Margaret Sanger, since the whole structure of the feminist dream of society rests upon the rapid extension of scientific knowledge about birth control. So here we see the first mention of birth control by a suffrage leader. Other suffragists also joined the fight for birth control. Mary Ware Dennett, the most famous birth control advocate after Margaret Sanger, began her suffrage work as field secretary of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association in 1908. She later served as corresponding secretary for NASA in New York. In 1915, Dennett left NASA to work full-time toward reforming birth control laws. Along with friends from NASA, including Clara Gruning-Stillman and lawyer Jesse Ashley, Dennett formed the first birth control organization in the United States, the National Birth Control League, at Stillman's home on March 31st, 1915. Later, she would change the name of the organization to the Voluntary Parenthood League to reflect her philosophy that birth control was a question for the individual family to decide. And this terminology, you'll note, echoed early activists' use of the term voluntary motherhood. She also wrote a sex education pamphlet called The Sex Side of Life, which was the topic of a famous obscenity trial, which is beyond the scope of this paper. Some African-American suffragists also supported the cause of birth control. One of the most prominent was the Harlem Renaissance writer Angelina Weld Grimke, grandniece of abolitionist Angelina Grimke Weld. Sanger published Grimke's short stories, The Closing Door and Goldie, in the Birth Control Review. Like white suffragists, Grimke decried women's lack of bodily autonomy within marriage, an institution that she too likened to slavery. Grimke's stories depicted the added burdens of African American women facing marriage and motherhood in a racist society. When women become equal with men by receiving the vote, Grimke argued, these injustices will end. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, some former suffragists continued their work for women's equality in the birth control movement. So for many former suffragists, the battle had just started, and others started to work for the Equal Rights Amendment. So there was continuing activism long after suffrage. Suffrage was just the first step. For women in Connecticut, winning the vote was merely the first step in achieving equality for women. Former Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association President Katherine Houghton Hepburn and her colleagues Catherine Beach Day, Annie Porritt, and Josephine Bennett attended Sanger's first American birth control conference in New York in 1921, which inspired them to create a Connecticut chapter of Sanger's American Birth Control League. Porritt became editor of Sanger's Birth Control Review, and Day helped finance the American Birth Control League. Porritt and Day distributed birth control literature at the 1922 annual convention of the Connecticut League of Women Voters, where they tried to gain support for their campaign to have the General Assembly amend the state's 1879 anti-contraception law. And the reason that there were laws all over the country that limited the use of birth control. Connecticut's was the most stringent in the nation. It was the only one to outlaw the actual use of birth control. Most outlawed the distribution or advertisement of birth control. The Connecticut statute also had an abetting clause, which made it anyone providing contraception to a woman liable to a fine or jail sentence. Although weakly enforced, the Connecticut law was still a formidable challenge to those who wanted to set up birth control clinics in the state. Once a birth control clinic was set up, it was immediately shut down by the police. Birth control advocates were especially concerned about how the law created economic disparities in access to contraception. They knew that as women of means, they could afford physicians who could quietly provide them with birth control. Low-income women had no such options. Porritt argued that let me just went on with my PowerPoint. Sorry. Here's Annie Porritt. Porritt argued that birth control should be available to women regardless of income. Like more affluent women, she said, all working women have a right to information, a right to control the size of their families. By the late 1920s, birth control advocates in Connecticut had succeeded in convincing women from across the political spectrum to support the cause. One volunteer proudly told Day that a coworker had reached women who were deeply interested in the subject of birth control, but also extremely active and influential in the substantial conservative circles. Of course, the more advanced radical set has always advocated birth control. So So the birth control movement in Connecticut was reaching even more conservative women by the late 1920s. But Connecticut birth control leaders would spend the next 40 years trying to persuade the state's General Assembly to reform contraceptive laws, but were unsuccessful. And it would take a US Supreme Court decision, Griswold versus Connecticut in 1965, to finally rid the state of what one Supreme Court justice called an uncommonly silly law. This does not mean that women's activism post-suffrage was weak, as some historians have argued. Rather, women who advocated for birth control and other social causes faced overwhelming opposition from entrenched political institutions dominated by men. And this was particularly true in the state of Connecticut. Moreover, it is important to recognize continuities between women's activism before and after the 19th Amendment was passed. The groundwork for birth control activism in the Nutmeg State and elsewhere was laid by discussions of women's rights to themselves during the suffrage era. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. And we are now open for some questions. And you can type your question in the chat, or you can use the question and answer function in the webinar. But I know Cindy's got a question to kick us off.
I do. Heather, can you just tell us a little bit about how this topic became of interest to you? I think I know, but I would like to let everybody know.
I was actually working on the origins of Planned Parenthood, and it was the suffrage centennial was coming up, and a colleague said, who was working on Ware Dennett, said, "Hey, let's write a paper about this." So, so we did. So this is actually a longer version of this I co-authored with a colleague. I can give you the information about that if you want.
Cool.
So we have a question that's come in, which is, how was the development of the pill for working class women? So far, it seems many of these women were elite who fought for this.
Could you repeat that?
How was the development of the pill for working class women?
Okay, so
how it seems that many of these women were elite who fought for this.
So the birth control movement was led by elite women, but they wanted to make sure that lower income women had access to contraception. So the development of the pill occurred in the 1950s, and you needed to be able to get access to a doctor to get the pill. So women with health insurance or the means to go to a physician could get the pill, but low-income women didn't have access to the pill. So Planned Parenthood set up clinics to distribute the pill and other contraceptives, and Connecticut efforts to open Planned Parenthood clinics were the last effort to set up a clinic was in the 1940s, and that was shut down by the police. And so Planned Parenthood Connecticut basically gave up trying to set up clinics, instead took women out of state to get contraception.
So we have another question, which I think is also kind of interesting, and that was contraception was illegal in Connecticut.
Right.
Or what was it, illegal for men and women?
Men could buy condoms were available for prevention of disease. So men could buy condoms anywhere. So people who knew that you could use it for contraception.
So, but a woman was not allowed to have a condom for the prevention of disease.
Well, a woman couldn't buy condoms.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose she was allowed to have it, but they were marketed specifically for prevention of disease. So yeah, so there's a double standard.
Yeah. I think you answered another question that had come in, which was the socioeconomic, what was the socioeconomic condition of some of the suffrage leaders, and birth control leaders at this point?
They tended to come from the middle class, upper middle class. Although that's kind of like a relative thing, like, but it was tended to come from a more middle class backgrounds. But they did recruit working class women too. There's a number of very well-known working class women in the suffrage movement who, particularly towards the end when they were active, when suffragists were active recruiting women from the labor movement.
So post the right to vote, did the birth control movement suffer when the right to vote was gained? It seems like they had an ally, they had a momentum. You get the right to vote, the right to vote. I'm just wondering, like, what was the momentum? What was the post the right to vote? Was there any? Did it decrease, increase? What happened after?
Birth control movements gained in popularity after the right to vote in the 1920s and 30s. Birth control became more acceptable. There was a survey in some popular magazine in the 1930s that said that 70% of all Americans surveyed favored birth control, but that didn't do anything about the laws that restricted access. So,
right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Prescott, for this great discussion, and to all of you. Oh, we have another question. We have a question that just came in. Cool.
Since women were deprived of education, how was the development of the pill? How was it managed? Was it through women? Was it men who gained sympathy for women?
The development of the the scientists who developed the pill were men, but there were women doctors who were kind of instrumental in popularizing the pill and making sure that women had access to it. So there were men who were sympathetic towards women. So there's a lot of the fact that birth control movement sort of gets taken over by men in the mid, because it becomes once the American medical profession with a pill, you need the involvement of doctors, and most doctors are men, and Planned Parenthood's leadership was mostly male. So, but that didn't mean that women were excluded. It just meant that men were in leadership.
Well, thank you again so much for this discussion, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We're so happy to be bringing this lecture series, Serving Up History, and we're really excited that it's going to keep continuing next week. And we're lucky to have our very own Cynthia Riccio give a talk on 3 remarkable women of the Webb Dean Stevens houses in the 20th century. Mary Coleman Wells, Margaret Clark Fenn, and Ginny Sanford Andrews. So we're looking very much forward to that and to seeing you all next week on Serving Up History. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Prescott. And
thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And from Ann Guernsey says, thank you, everyone. Take care.